The pages that follow chronicle the extraordinary journey of one of the 20th century's boldest thinkers, Bertrand Russell. These chapters unfold the major turning points, intellectual adventures, and moral commitments that shaped Russell's extraordinary life, painting a vivid portrait of a man who epitomized the courage to think freely. At a time when so much in society, academia, and public discourse was governed by inherited dogma and rigid conventions, Russell's unyielding pursuit of reason and his passionate advocacy for independent thought stand as beacons to anyone seeking intellectual honesty and moral clarity. Russell was born into an aristocratic British family, tutored by privileged circumstances and haunted by deep personal anguish. From the earliest days of his childhood, loss and solitude formed the crucible in which his mind was cast. He emerged from a world of Victorian strictures, not as a mere inheritor of tradition, but as a restless questioner, insatiably curious and fiercely skeptical. His brilliant mathematical mind would lead him to Cambridge, where he found not only the tools of philosophical rigor, but also friendships that fueled and challenged his ideas about the universe, truth, and humanity. Throughout his life, Russell refused easy answers. Whether wrestling with the paradoxes of logic, challenging the prevailing doctrines of war and patriotism, or reimagining personal relationships and societal roles, he insisted upon a relentless questioning, a logic that would disturb those in power and inspire generations after him. Through his scholarly triumphs, such as the Principia Mathematica, he laid the groundwork for modern logic and analytic philosophy, forever altering the landscape of intellectual inquiry. But he was not, as some would have it, a mere theorist ensconced in ivory towers. Russell's conscience, honed on the whetstone of reason but tempered by compassion, compelled him into the arena of social activism, pacifism, and advocacy for human rights. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button to support the channel. And don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss an audiobook that could change your life. Now let's begin. Enjoy. Chapter 1. A Mind is Born, Early Life and Education. In the morning light of May 18, 1872, Bertrand William Russell entered a world as complex in its inheritance as it was privileged in its lineage. Born at Ravenscroft, a mansion in Trellick, Monmouthshire, Russell was the descendant of two illustrious families, the Russells, Earls of Bedford, and the Stanleys. From the outset, the spectre of loss shadowed his early existence. Within years of his birth, both parents died. His father, John Russell, Viscount Amberley, a free-spirited advocate for secularism, and his mother, Catherine, a woman of rare intellect and progressive ideas, orphaned at a tender age. Russell and his brother Frank were placed under the guardianship of their paternal grandparents. Lady Russell, his grandmother, was a singular figure, a stern evangelist with a deep sense of moral purpose. She cultivated in Bertrand the habits of discipline and reflection, but also imposed a religiosity and conservatism that challenged the boy's emerging curiosity. The household at Pembroke Lodge, their residence in Richmond Park, was a tableau of Victorian respectability, but within its walls, Russell's imagination found refuge amidst the stern protocols of his elders. A solitary child, Russell spent hours engrossed in books, maps, and mathematics. He later reflected that loneliness and melancholy were early tutors. It was in solitude that he learned to question. The absence of parental affection was partially offset by an intellectual inheritance, as the young Bertrand became a precocious student of abstract thought. His grandmother's insistence on private tutoring ensured that his education would be rigorous and classical. Latin, Greek, history, and philosophy formed the pillars of his curriculum, yet the intellectual ethos of Pembroke Lodge was one of subtle contradiction. Lady Russell's moral rectitude conflicted with the free-thinking legacy of Bertrand's father. John Russell had prescribed not only guardianship, but also a certain intellectual freedom, a provision the courts overturned in favor of Lady Russell's more conservative approach. This clash of worldviews planted the first seeds of rebellion in Bertrand, who grew increasingly restless as he encountered the strictures of received wisdom. His education advanced rapidly, as Bertrand soon demonstrated exceptional faculties in mathematics and logic. At age 11, Russell was given Euclid's Elements, and it was here that his philosophical path found its first true calling. The logical precision of Euclid's axioms entranced him. He later described the impact as a glimpse into another world, where truths stood apart from the shifting tides of human whim. Mathematics became not merely a subject, but a sanctuary and guide, one that would shape his thinking and motivations throughout life. Aside from mathematics, his private reading traversed wide landscapes: Plato and Aristotle, Mill and Kant, poetry and science. By 14, Russell wrestled with existential questions: the nature of reality, the problem of evil, and the limits of certainty. These were not academic speculations, but reflections seeded by childhood trauma. His anxieties were profound. He contemplated suicide, saved only by his love for mathematics and the hope that its pure, impersonal truths could provide an anchor in a world of emotional storms. As a young man, Russell's path was set toward Cambridge. The family tradition dictated elite education, and Trinity College beckoned, a citadel of mathematics and philosophical inquiry. But before Russell arrived, the crucible of adolescence had tempered his intellect. His experiences were marked by an abiding loneliness, sharpened by questioning and reflection. The values of rationality, doubt, and independence germinated in the isolation of his youth. Upon entry to Cambridge, the young Russell carried not only the habits of rigorous thought, but the scars and strengths forged in solitude. Looking back upon his origins, it is clear that his early education and the adversity woven throughout it provided both the drive and the context for a life centered on the courage to think freely. As we turn now to his formative years at Cambridge, we witness the flowering of Russell's extraordinary mind, set against the background of tradition, rebellion, and possibility. Chapter 2: The Shaping of a Philosopher. Cambridge and Beyond. The threshold of Trinity College, Cambridge, marked a profound transformation in Bertrand Russell's life, a turning point where intellect met community, ideas met challenge, and the solitary doubts of youth blossomed into collaborative inquiry. Arriving at Cambridge in 1890, Russell entered one of Britain's most venerable institutions, its ancient courts steeped in academic tradition. Yet Trinity was also a crucible for innovation, and in its libraries and common rooms, the foundations of modern philosophy would be quietly uprooted. As an undergraduate, Russell gravitated toward mathematics and philosophy, his reputation as an exceptional scholar preceding him. The precision of logical reasoning and the expansive scope of metaphysical inquiry became twin pillars of his intellectual identity. At Cambridge, Russell quickly established himself among a remarkable generation of thinkers: G.E. Moore, Alfred North Whitehead, and J.M. Keynes, among others. Each were destined to shape the intellectual landscape of the coming century. It was under the tutelage of Alfred North Whitehead that Russell's passion for logic and foundational questions flourished. Whitehead, a mathematician and philosopher of symphonic intellect, recognized in Russell a rare capacity for sustained abstraction and critical acumen. Their intellectual partnership, which would later yield the monumental Principia Mathematica, began in the informal meetings and discussions that animated collegiate life. Russell imbibed from Whitehead not only techniques of symbolic logic, but also the importance of relentless questioning, skepticism, and clarity. The culture at Cambridge in the late 19th century was paradoxically both traditional and radical. While formal education demanded deference to authority, the boundaries of discourse were often porous and lines between disciplines fluid. Russell devoted himself to the study of the Greek classics, moral philosophy, mathematics, and economics. He came under the influence of G.E. Moore, whose commitment to analytic clarity and realistic philosophy inspired a new rigor in ancient metaphysical debates. More's insistence that philosophy should begin with common sense and proceed only by means of precise analysis left an indelible mark on Russell's thought. Yet Russell was not content merely to parrot the wisdom of his forebears. He questioned both foundational logic and ethical assumptions, beginning to articulate his own philosophical stance, a rejection of idealism and a turn toward realism. His first major publication, an essay on the foundations of geometry, 1897, revealed an early inclination toward the reconciliation of mathematical abstraction with the demands of philosophical inquiry. Russell's time at Cambridge was also a period of intense personal development and social engagement. He became involved with the Cambridge Apostles, a society committed to intellectual exploration and honest discourse. The camaraderie and debate within the Apostles provided a fertile environment for the flourishing of ideas. Philosophy here was more than an academic exercise. It was a way of living. The years at Cambridge witnessed Russell's deepening concern for the broader questions of human existence, truth, morality, and the requirements of a good life. He developed the conviction that reason must be wedded to ethical responsibility, that philosophy must answer not only what is true, but how truth might be lived. These convictions were sharpened by the intellectual sparring that characterized Cambridge life, but also by the gradual emergence of Russell's skepticism toward received systems. He began to challenge both metaphysical idealism and religious orthodoxy. Beyond Cambridge, Russell's horizons widened further. He traveled to Germany, absorbing the philosophical innovations of Kant and the logical innovations of Frege. Exposure to continental thinking reinforced the desire to subject all knowledge, even mathematical, to critical analysis. The seeds sown at Cambridge, rigor, doubt, community, bore fruit in Russell's resolve to build a new foundation for logic and philosophy. On leaving Trinity College with a first-class degree, Russell did not retreat into narrow specialization. Instead, he dedicated himself to the grand questions that would define his life's work. Cambridge had given him a toolkit, precision, clarity, and collaboration. But more importantly, it had instilled the courage to question even the most sacred of ideas. The shaping of Russell, the philosopher, was thus not merely a matter of institutional training, but of an emboldened spirit, ready to challenge the world for the sake of reason and humanity. Chapter 3, Logic and Love, the Marriage of Reason and Emotion. In the course of Bertrand Russell's development as a thinker, the interplay between logic and love, between reason and emotion, emerged as one of the defining themes of both his intellectual and personal life. Far from being mere abstractions, these forces shaped his philosophy, relationships, and the cultural legacy he would leave behind. From the earliest days of mathematical study, Russell understood the seductive power of clarity. Mathematics for him was an escape from the emotional tempest of his childhood. In logical proof, he found a form of beauty untouched by the unpredictabilities of human affection. Yet Russell also recognized the limitations of logic when confronted with the complexity of lived experience. His reflections on truth, happiness, and morality continually circled back to the necessity of emotion, a recognition that reason alone could not answer the problems of the human condition. Russell's personal life throughout his early adulthood was marked by profound emotional longing. His first serious romantic attachment was to Alice Pearsall Smith, an American Quaker. Their courtship, begun at Cambridge, was a source of joy and anxiety. The union, formalized in marriage in 1894, was as much an intellectual partnership as it was an affair of the heart. Alice, spiritual and idealistic, inspired Russell to consider the deeper dimensions of human connection. Their partnership, however, was soon fraught with tensions arising from conflicting temperaments and expectations. The philosophical import of Russell's relationship to Alice, its joys, quarrels, and disillusionments filtered into his professional life. He came to see love not as irrational, but as a complementary aspect of rational inquiry. Love, in Russell's account, was a dynamic of desire, vulnerability, and empathy, necessary for understanding both self and other. His treatises on marriage, free love, and sexual ethics reflect a search for forms of relationship that honor both autonomy and intimacy, a vision radically at odds with the Victorian norms of his time. As his marriage to Alice deteriorated, Russell found himself increasingly disenchanted with the constraints of social convention. He began to advocate not only for intellectual freedom, but for the liberation of human affection. His idea that love could be a catalyst for moral development, and his insistence on the compatibility of reason and emotion, ran counter to orthodoxies that treated passion with suspicion. In later writings, Russell would argue that love, like thought, required courage, the courage to face vulnerability, disappointment, and the uncertainties of human connection. This philosophical stance was not merely theoretical. Russell's subsequent relationships, marked by scandal and controversy, tested his convictions on the interplay of reason and emotion. His intellectual partnerships, most notably with Ludwig Wittgenstein, were profoundly intense, marked by admiration, conflict, and sometimes heartbreak. Wittgenstein, who arrived at Cambridge in 1911, challenged Russell's views on logic and the limits of language. Their exchanges were amplified by emotional tension, as Russell struggled to integrate rational analysis with the messiness of human affection. In works such as The Problems of Philosophy and Marriage and Morals, Russell articulates a vision in which reason and love are not adversaries, but collaborators in the pursuit of a good life. He maintains that love alone is insufficient for moral action without the guidance of reason, and that reason is ultimately sterile unless animated by the warmth of human connection. The marriage of reason and emotion, in Russell's account, is not a matter of balance or compromise, but of mutual enrichment. Russell's evolving views on love and logic were echoed by the social and cultural revolutions of the early 20th century. As new forms of relationship, sexuality, and sociality emerged, he provided both philosophical justification and practical guidance. His defense of free love, reproductive rights, and women's emancipation positioned him as a moral pioneer, advocating forms of relationship grounded in autonomy, honesty, and compassion. Perhaps most importantly, Russell's account of the marriage between reason and emotion resonated with his broader commitment to freedom. Freedom not merely of thought, but of feeling. He understood that the courage to think freely required, at its core, the courage to love freely, to embrace uncertainty, to acknowledge vulnerability, and to seek truth in both intellect and affection. In the tapestry of Russell's life, logic and love were interwoven threads, each strengthening the other, creating a vision of humanity as both rational and passionate, endlessly questioning and endlessly yearning. Chapter 4. Principia Mathematica, Building the Foundations of Logic. The Principia Mathematica, co-authored by Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead, constitutes one of the most significant achievements in the history of logic and the foundations of mathematics. Published between 1910 and 1913, the three-volume treatise set out to provide a rigorous axiomatic basis for all mathematical truths, revolutionizing the discipline and laying the groundwork for the philosophical movement known as analytic philosophy. The context in which the Principia Mathematica arose was one of both intellectual ferment and conceptual crisis. By the opening years of the 20th century, mathematicians and philosophers faced paradoxes that threatened the edifice of logical certainty. The discovery of Russell's paradox, a contradiction within the very notion of a set of all sets, exposed deep ambiguities in foundational assumptions previously taken for granted. What was needed was a radical rethinking, an attempt to secure mathematics on incontestable logical ground. Russell and Whitehead brought to this challenge an extraordinary blend of mathematical competence and philosophical rigor. Their aim was nothing less than to show that all of mathematics could be derived from a limited set of logical axioms and inference rules. Such an aspiration reflected both ambition and humility. Ambition in its scope, humility in its refusal to accept any proposition without proof. The construction of the Principia Mathematica was Herculean in its demands. Working side by side, often in isolation and exhaustion, Russell and Whitehead developed a formal symbolic notation, specifying the precise rules by which mathematical statements might be derived from logical premises. The result was a system of extraordinary sophistication, each step meticulously justified, each theorem following inevitably from its antecedents. The treatise opens with the philosophy of logic itself, questions about meaning, reference, and symbolism. Here, Russell's innovation was to treat language and logic as interdependent, to analyze the structures by which statements acquire significance and truth. His theory of types was introduced as a response to the paradoxes of set theory, providing a hierarchy of logical levels that precluded self-contradictory definitions. The heart of the Principia Mathematica is its systematic derivation of mathematical truths. From the most basic logical principles, such as identity and implication, the authors carefully build up arithmetic, number theory, and eventually real analysis. The famous proof of the proposition 1 + 1 = 2 arrives only after hundreds of pages, epitomizing the rigor and patience required. Russell himself joked about the labor involved, recalling the dreadful grind of formalization. The impact of the Principia Mathematica was immediate and profound. In academic circles, it set the standard for rigor in both logic and philosophy. It inspired the development of symbolic logic, mathematical logic, and set the stage for the later advances of Kurt Gödel, whose incompleteness theorems would uncover fundamental limitations in the project. Yet Russell's motivations were not purely technical. The quest for logical certainty, expressed in the Principia Mathematica, mirrored his broader philosophical ambition to banish dogma, to think freely, to submit every belief to the test of reason. The treatise was a monument to intellectual courage, an attempt to ground knowledge not in authority, but in clarity and proof. Russell's achievement in logic did not isolate him from broader philosophical concerns. Through the Principia Mathematica, he forged connections between mathematics, philosophy, and language, anticipating the later linguistic turn in analytic philosophy. He understood that the structure of thought and the structure of expression were intertwined, and that the quest for knowledge demanded both precision of reasoning and honesty of linguistic representation. The Principia Mathematica stands today as a testament to the power of collaborative inquiry, the discipline of rigor, and the unyielding pursuit of truth. For Russell, it was both a moment of triumph and a challenge, reminding us that no achievement in reason is ever final, that every certainty invites new questions. In building the foundations of logic, Russell gave philosophy a new architecture, inviting generations to think more freely, more critically, and more daringly. Chapter 5. The War Within, Conscience and Pacifism in World War I. For Bertrand Russell, the outbreak of the First World War in 1914 did not simply signify a clash of empires or the collision of armies. It was a profound moral crisis, a moment in history that demanded the reckoning of conscience against the juggernaut of collective passion and violence. In a climate where patriotism quickly became synonymous with support for warfare, and dissent was cast as treachery, Russell's courageous stand for pacifism marked him as both a pariah and a prophet. Russell's opposition to the war was rooted not in sentimental utopianism, but in a sober analysis of both the causes and inevitable consequences of mass conflict. Educated at Cambridge and steeped in the analytical rigor of mathematical philosophy, he viewed the justifications offered for war, national honor, security, duty, as often little more than alluring abstractions masking deeper interests and primal fears. Central to Russell's pacifism was his belief that human life, with all its potential for joy and discovery, should not be sacrificed upon the altar of unexamined loyalties. From the war's outset, Russell articulated a position of uncompromising moral clarity, publishing pamphlets and delivering lectures that unmasked the cruelty and futility of the conflict. In his widely circulated essay, Justice in Wartime, Russell dissected the popular rhetoric of the day, exposing the hypocrisy in the claim that war was waged in the defense of civilization. Instead, he cautioned against the corrupting influence of war on both winners and losers, arguing that violence only engendered further hatred, repression, and social disintegration. This principled dissent came at considerable personal cost. Russell lost his lectureship at Trinity College, Cambridge, the institution that had nurtured his early philosophical discoveries and friendships. He was fined, surveilled, and branded as subversive. Public vilification reached its zenith in 1918 when Russell, for opposing the conscription of young men into the British military, was imprisoned for 6 months. Yet these trials served only to intensify his commitment, revealing the full measure of his moral courage. Russell's pacifism was not merely a reaction to the horrors of mechanized slaughter. It was the inevitable conclusion of a lifetime's reflections on ethics, reason, and personal responsibility. He believed that every individual bore an inalienable obligation to judge for themselves the justice of their society's actions. To succumb to herd mentality was, for Russell, to betray one's own humanity and to participate willingly in the machinery of destruction. Within the solitude of his prison cell, Russell found affirmation for his stance. He was under no illusions regarding the reach of his influence. He knew his words were unlikely to sway the course of battle. Yet he maintained that the ultimate purpose of philosophy was not the evasion of conflict, but the search for truth, especially when such truth proved uncomfortable or dangerous. To live by one's conscience in defiance of the mob was, for Russell, the highest calling of reason. Russell's example as a pacifist did not simply rest in his writings or actions, but in the clarity with which he illuminated the war's psychological toll upon its participants. He anticipated the shell-shocked generation, the disillusionment that would haunt post-war Europe, and he recognized that the seeds of future strife were being sown amid the carnage and rhetoric. He pleaded for a world where rational discourse could prevail over the primal instincts nurtured by conflict, a vision ambitious but, in his view, not unattainable. His pacifism thus stands as an enduring testament to the power of individual conscience. In times of national hysteria, Russell believed, the willingness to think clearly, to weigh evidence dispassionately, and act upon conviction rather than conformity, is the only hope for humanity's redemption. This chapter opens our journey into the drama and greatness of Russell's life, setting the stage for the intellectual and personal odysseys that would follow. Chapter 6: Love, Scandal, and Society, the personal side of Russell. If Russell's public life was a relentless confrontation with authority and unreason, his private life was an often equally dramatic stage where love, desire, and scandal played out against the broader backcloth of a rapidly changing society. To understand Russell solely as a philosopher is to miss the unquenchable passions and vulnerabilities that animated his intellectual quest. His personal relationships, by turns fragile, fervid, and tumultuous, both reflected and shaped his distinctive worldview. Born into the upper echelons of British aristocracy, Bertrand Russell was raised in an atmosphere of privilege that soon revealed itself as a crucible of loneliness and loss. Orphaned at a young age, he was brought up under the severe guardianship of his grandmother, Lady Russell, a formidable presence whose strict moral code clashed with the young Bertrand's emerging sense of individual autonomy. This early experience with authority, loving yet dogmatic, instilled in Russell not only a profound yearning for affection, but also a determination never to surrender his independence. Russell's marriages and affairs were the subject of both public fascination and personal anguish. His first marriage, to the American Quaker Alice Pearsall Smith, began in the hopeful optimism of youth, but broke down as Russell's intellectual horizons expanded. His affair with Lady Ottoline Morell, a figure at the heart of literary and artistic bohemia, introduced him to a milieu that cherished free expression, unconventionality, and emotional candor. These relationships, often scandalous by Edwardian standards, revealed Russell's belief in the primacy of honesty and communication over societal conformity. Yet Russell's commitment to the ideals of freedom and truth extended even to matters of the heart. He advocated for open relationships and was one of the first public intellectuals to discuss sexuality and marriage with candor rare for his era. In Marriage and Morals, he assailed the hypocrisies and double standards of Victorian sexual morality, arguing that human happiness was best served by sincerity and mutual respect rather than legalism or repression. Such views incited moral outrage, resulting in the loss of academic positions and public vilification. Yet for Russell, the willingness to challenge orthodoxy, whether in thought or in love, was a mark of intellectual and personal integrity. Russell's personal life, replete with heartbreak and longing, illuminated the limitations of rationalism alone. As he himself confessed, he was not only a logician, but a lover. The deaths of close friends, failed romantic attachments, and estrangement from his own children left emotional scars that even the most rigorous philosophical analysis could not heal. These experiences humanized his philosophy, imbuing his writings on ethics and human happiness with a rare compassion and humility. Moreover, the public reaction to Russell's private conduct underscored the persistent tension between individual liberty and collective morality. The tabloids' fascination with his affairs, divorces, and controversial writings mirrored the wider societal anxiety provoked by changing sexual mores, the rise of feminism, and the gradual erosion of Anglican certainties. Like his forebear, Mary Shelley, Russell became a lightning rod for debates about the proper limits of personal freedom and moral experimentation. In this light, Russell's personal life was not merely an adjunct to his philosophy, but a living laboratory in which he tested the boundaries of reason, emotion, and social expectation. His willingness to live according to his principles, even at great cost, provided a model for future generations who would grapple with similar questions of autonomy and authenticity. The scandals that shadowed his name did not diminish his stature, but served to underscore the radical honesty and complexity of a man determined to explore every facet of human experience. Thus, to approach Russell's legacy is to recognize that the courage to think freely, so vividly displayed in his intellectual work, found its counterpart in his personal life, where the search for truth and happiness demanded not only brilliance, but also vulnerability and risk. In embracing both the ecstasies and agonies of love, Russell gave living proof of his conviction that a life worth living must be a life lived fully in all its contradictions. Chapter 7. The Pursuit of Truth, Philosophy as a Way of Life. To Bertrand Russell, philosophy was far more than a discipline, an academic pursuit, or a collection of abstract systems. Instead, it represented a vital personal commitment to the pursuit of truth, one that shaped one's understanding of the world and one's conduct within it. This chapter explores Russell's vision of philosophy not merely as an intellectual enterprise, but as a way of life, a continual reckoning with the limits of certainty, the temptations of dogma, and the obligations inherent in honest inquiry. Russell's earliest encounters with philosophy began in the shadows of personal tragedy and existential uncertainty. orphaned and subsequently raised in an environment imbued with both religious piety and skeptical rationalism. Russell soon discovered that philosophy was uniquely equipped to address the basic anxieties of the human condition. For Russell, philosophy's first task was the articulation of fundamental questions: the nature of reality, the possibility of knowledge, and the grounds of ethical action. His own journey began with a critical engagement with empiricism and idealism, inherited from predecessors like Hume, Kant, and Mill. Through rigorous self-discipline, Russell mastered the technical apparatus of logic and mathematics, culminating in the monumental work Principia Mathematica, co-authored with Alfred North Whitehead. Here, he sought to establish the logical foundations of mathematics, believing that clarity could only be attained through the purification of language. While the technicalities of this work lie beyond most lay readers, its philosophical significance lies in its exemplification of Russell's conviction that vigilance against error must extend even to our most basic assumptions. Yet Russell's conception of philosophy was never narrow or purely formal. As he moved through the academic ranks, he became increasingly concerned with the practical consequences of philosophical inquiry. Philosophy, he wrote, if it cannot answer the questions of daily life, loses its claim to respect. Rejecting the insularity of scholasticism, Russell insisted that philosophy should address the crises of its time: war, injustice, superstition, and the abuse of power. For Russell, the philosopher's duty was to dispel confusion by exposing unexamined assumptions, whether in metaphysics, religion, or politics. This analytic method, with its commitment to precision and clarity, was not solely an intellectual exercise, but an ethical imperative. It was through relentless questioning and openness to revision that philosophy fulfilled its highest aim: the liberation of the mind from prejudice and fear. Russell recognized, too, the dangers inherent in the philosophical enterprise. Excessive skepticism, he warned, could lead to paralysis. Uncritical acceptance of authority could result in tyranny. The true philosopher walked a difficult path between gullibility and nihilism, between unwarranted certainty and absolute doubt. It was a path that demanded both humility before the facts and courage in the assertion of reason. Russell's pursuit of truth, then, was at once deeply personal and profoundly universal. Philosophy offered him both solace and challenge, a means of making sense of life's uncertainties and an invitation to continual self-examination. His writings, lectures, and public interventions all testify to a life lived under the discipline of rational inquiry and the restless search for understanding. In sum, for Russell, philosophy was not a refuge from the world's confusion, but an engagement with it. Whether dealing with abstract problems in logic or urgent questions of justice and peace, the philosopher's vocation was always the same: to think freely, critically, and compassionately. In this sense, Russell's life exemplifies what it means to make philosophy one's way of being, a daily practice animated by the humble, persistent pursuit of truth. Chapter 8: Religion Under Reason. Why Russell Chose Atheism. One of the most defining and contentious aspects of Bertrand Russell's personal and intellectual identity was his forthright atheism. In an era still deeply bound by religious convention, Russell's journey from the piety of his childhood household to an unapologetic embrace of reason over faith marked a profound transformation, an odyssey that reflected both his rigor as a thinker and his commitment to truth at all costs. Russell's earliest years were marked by the presence of religious teachings, but he soon found himself at odds with their certainties. The death of both parents and the subsequent guardianship of his devoutly religious grandmother introduced him at an early age to questions of mortality, suffering, and the meaning of existence. Yet rather than accepting theological dogma, these experiences nurtured in him a spirit of inquiry. Rather than soothing his anxieties, Christian doctrine often appeared to the young Russell as a source of confusion and intellectual distress. As his education progressed, Russell encountered the formidable tradition of Western philosophy, a tradition in which belief and doubt, reason and revelation existed in perpetual tension. From Hume's skepticism to Kant's critical philosophy, Russell found resources for a thoughtful interrogation of religious claims. Over time, he concluded that faith, defined as belief beyond or in spite of evidence, ran counter to the demands of intellectual honesty. Why I Am Not a Christian, Russell's most famous essay on the subject, would later crystallize these doubts into a systematic and memorable critique. Russell's rejection of religious faith was not motivated by hostility or iconoclasm for its own sake. Rather, he argued that the only firm ground on which one could build a worldview was reason and evidence. In public debates, lectures, and writings, he challenged the central arguments for God's existence, the first cause, the moral argument, and the argument from design. Each, he pointed out, relied either on logical fallacies, special pleading, or appeals to emotion. Equally important was Russell's assessment of the practical consequences of religious belief. He was not insensitive to the consolations that faith offered to many, but he viewed the institutional power of religion, with its claims to authority, moral absolutism, and intolerance, as inherently dangerous. For Russell, religious dogma had too often been allied with oppression, censorship, and violence. To think freely, he insisted, was to accept no belief on faith alone, to remain open to revision in light of new evidence, and to recognize that the absence of certainty was not a defect, but a moral and intellectual achievement. In rejecting religion, Russell did not succumb to cynicism or nihilism. Instead, he affirmed the possibility of meaning, beauty, and moral aspiration within a wholly natural universe. The sense of awe and wonder, so often associated with religious experience, could, he argued, be preserved within the framework of a rational, secular worldview. The good life, Russell wrote, is one inspired by love and guided by knowledge. This, for him, was both a moral maxim and a statement of metaphysical truth. Russell's outspoken atheism came at a cost. He was denied academic posts, vilified in the press, and his works were at times banned or censored. Yet it was precisely this willingness to brave the disapproval of his time that made his stand so significant. For Russell, the difference between faith and reason was the difference between enslavement and freedom, the difference between accepting the world as it is and seeking endlessly to improve it. In this way, Russell's choice of atheism was not simply a rejection of one tradition, but an affirmation of a particular mode of being in the world, one committed to doubt, to honesty, and to the ceaseless striving for greater understanding. In his life and thought, he offered a model of integrity for all who would place reason above custom and inquiry above authority. Chapter 9, Freedom of Thought, Standing Against Dogma. Through both his writings and his example, Bertrand Russell became one of the 20th century's most eloquent defenders of the freedom of thought. He understood that the vitality of any civilization depends upon the willingness of its members to question received wisdom, to resist pressure to conform, and to defend their right and the right of others to follow where reason leads. The climate of Russell's era was marked by enormous ideological tensions. The rise of totalitarian movements, the spread of propaganda, and the persistent allure of authoritarian solutions to social problems gave urgency to the defense of intellectual liberty. In countless essays, addresses, and debates, Russell diagnosed the dangers of dogma, the intellectual vice, as he called it, that constrains the mind and distorts the truth. Dogma, for Russell, was not limited to religion, but included any system of thought that demanded assent without evidence or suppressed dissent. Russell's logic and analytic philosophy were themselves acts of liberation. challenging the certainties inherited from previous generations. In works like Problems of Philosophy and Skeptical Essays, he argued that only through persistent scrutiny and skepticism could any society hope to achieve progress. Institutions, be they religious, academic, or political, had a tendency to calcify, to defend their authority by punishing independent thought. Russell saw this not only in the institutions of church and state, but also in the universities and media of his own time. His defense of free thought was not abstract, but intensely practical. Russell denounced censorship, restrictions on speech, and all forms of intellectual coercion. During periods of political repression, whether the anti-German hysteria of World War I or the Red Scare persecutions of intellectuals, he maintained that society's greatness lay in its capacity to tolerate dissenting voices. The opinions that are held with passion, he observed, are often those for which no good ground exists. Yet Russell was acutely aware of the psychological pressures that made dogmatic thinking attractive. The human desire for certainty and belonging, he noted, often led individuals to embrace ideologies that promised clarity and security. Russell aspired to cultivate both in himself and in others a different attitude, one that valued doubt and inquiry as virtues and recognized that certainty, when not grounded in evidence, was more dangerous than uncertainty. Russell's campaigns on behalf of academic freedom and intellectual honesty resonated far beyond the academy. He lent his voice to the defense of writers, educators, and dissidents persecuted for their beliefs, from conscientious objectors and anti-war activists to atheists and political radicals. Freedom of thought, Russell declared, is the guiding spirit of civilized life. When it perishes, so does civilization. He regarded education as the principal bulwark against the dangers of intellectual conformity. In his writings on pedagogy, he championed an education that encouraged critical inquiry, curiosity, and tolerance. This was not merely a prescription for individuals, but for society as a whole, a means of securing the conditions in which democracy and innovation could flourish. Russell's commitment to the freedom of thought was tested repeatedly and never found wanting. He stood by this principle not only in the face of public opprobrium, but at the cost of his reputation, career, and even liberty. His legacy endures in every society that upholds the right to question, to debate, and to think anew. It is, as he argued, both the birthright and the noblest responsibility of the human mind. Chapter 10. The Philosopher in Politics. Activism and Rebellion. Bertrand Russell's intellectual odyssey was inextricably intertwined with a passionate engagement in the political currents and upheavals of his time. Unlike those philosophers content to reside within the tranquil precincts of academia, Russell understood that ideas were not merely theoretical artifacts. Rather, they bore upon the lives of real people and the structures of real societies. His lifelong commitment to activism and rebellion marked him as a figure not only of intellectual portent, but of moral ferocity. Russell's foray into political activism began early, shaped by his upbringing among the British aristocracy and his own internal revolt against the dogmas of Victorian society. The influence of his grandmother, herself a progressive mind, provided both intellectual stimulation and moral compass. Yet it was Russell's exposure to the ferment of ideas at Cambridge that cemented a conviction: the search for truth must align itself with the pursuit of justice. The outbreak of the First World War was a crucible for Russell's activism. An outspoken pacifist, he denounced the nationalist fervor and patriotic pieties that pervaded Britain. For Russell, war was not a glorious enterprise, but a calamitous failure of reason and humanity. His opposition made him a pariah among many of his peers and brought the weight of public censure and official sanction. The university where he taught deprived him of his lectureship, and the state imprisoned him for his writings and speeches against conscription and militarism. Yet, far from instilling caution or resignation, These punishments emboldened Russell's resolve. His rebellion was not impulsive, but calculated, rooted in a deep philosophical commitment to individual liberty and rational dissent. He understood the moral necessity of civil disobedience in the face of unjust laws, a doctrine he would expand throughout his life, notably in his resistance to nuclear armament and his support of anti-colonial movements. Russell's activism was distinguished by its breadth and complexity. He was not a doctrinaire radical, but a pragmatic reformer, open to the merits of socialism and liberalism, yet wary of any ideology that claimed infallibility. His criticism of Soviet totalitarianism, despite his sympathy for socialist ideals, revealed an unyielding link between political principles and intellectual honesty. As the world entered the tumult of the 20th century, marked by the rise and fall of empires and the specter of global war, Russell's philosophic rebellion grew ever more urgent. The philosopher's duty, he insisted, extended beyond the confines of logic and metaphysics. Public engagement, protest, and even the risk of personal ruin, all were required where conscience and reason demanded. Russell's political writings, from his polemics against the horrors of war to his calls for greater social justice, were characterized by acute logic, coupled with a passionate plea for humanity. His essays and public addresses combined erudition with rhetorical force, challenging both the complacency of the privileged and the dogmatism of the revolutionary. He was intensely aware of the tension between activism and philosophical detachment. In his mature years, Russell often reflected on the dangers of fanaticism, urging that rebellion be tempered by reason and that zeal for reform remain subject to skeptical inquiry. Nevertheless, he was unrelenting in his belief that the philosopher's voice must not be silent when injustice prevails. Russell's legacy as a political activist endures. He walked in the front lines of anti-war marches, lent his name and prestige to countless causes, and bore the personal costs of dissent with dignity. His willingness to challenge authority and defy convention made him a beacon for later generations of activists and intellectuals. To realize the value of one's life, Russell wrote, it is not enough merely to live. One must live in harmony with one's deepest convictions, whether or not they are popular, profitable, or safe. As we examine Russell's rebellious life, we are called to reflect upon our own obligations as thinkers and citizens. His example urges us to consider that the courage to think freely is not only a matter of intellectual autonomy, but a charge to participate actively in the struggle for a more humane world. Chapter 11, Teaching the World to Think. Russell as a public intellectual. Bertrand. Russell's reputation as a public intellectual rests not merely on the breadth of his scholarship, but on his remarkable ability to communicate complex ideas to a diverse public. In an era when philosophy too often retreated behind the walls of academia, Russell strode boldly into the public square, determined to teach the world to think. Russell's talents as an educator were evident from the outset. As a young lecturer at Cambridge, his clarity of expression and capacity for logical analysis quickly distinguished him from his peers. But Russell's audience was never confined to the university. He aspired to reach ordinary people, those whose lives might be transformed by exposure to the rigors of reason and the pleasures of critical inquiry. His writing style, marked by precision, brevity, and wit, made philosophy accessible without sacrificing complexity. In works like Problems of Philosophy, Why I Am Not a Christian, and countless essays, Russell stripped away jargon, rendering difficult concepts intelligible and relevant. His commitment to intellectual honesty meant that even topics laden with controversy, God, morality, politics, were presented with candor and humility. Russell's role was that of a teacher, but also of a challenger. He did not seek to impose doctrines, but to provoke thought. He encouraged his readers and listeners to question inherited beliefs, scrutinize authority, and cultivate independent judgment. His famous admonition, "Do not fear to be eccentric in opinion, for every opinion now accepted was once eccentric," encapsulates his pedagogical ethos. He was a tireless advocate for education as the bedrock of a free society. Russell understood that ignorance breeds conformity and intolerance. His work as a founder of experimental schools, such as Beacon Hill, demonstrated his belief in the transformative power of intellectual curiosity unencumbered by dogma or rote instruction. His educational philosophy championed inquiry over indoctrination, creativity over compliance. The impact of Russell's public intellectualism extended globally. His lectures graced universities, radio programs, and international forums. He addressed audiences from school children to heads of state, always with the conviction that the pursuit of truth was universal. During the tumultuous years of world conflict, his broadcasts and speeches provided moral clarity and rational direction to war-weary populations. Central to Russell's teaching mission was his embrace of controversy. He welcomed debate, confronting religious orthodoxy, political convention, and philosophical orthodoxy alike. His critiques were incisive, yet always aimed at illuminating, not humiliating his opponents. He believed that progress depended upon dialogue and the willingness to reconsider even cherished convictions. Russell's legacy as a public intellectual endures in the countless thinkers, educators, and activists who cite him as an inspiration. His insistence that reason must guide public discourse remains as urgent now as in his own time. The courage to question, to teach, and to learn stands as a monument to his life's work. In evaluating Russell's role, we see a vision of intellectual life, not a solitary pursuit, but a shared endeavor. Through teaching the world to think, Russell not only shaped the minds of his generation, but also laid the groundwork for the ongoing struggle against ignorance and intolerance. Chapter 12. The Value of Skepticism, Questioning Everything. Bertrand Russell's intellectual enterprise revolved around the cultivation of skepticism, not as a negative or destructive force, but as a dynamic principle central to inquiry and progress. For Russell, the act of questioning everything lay at the heart of authentic thought and discovery. Skepticism was, for Russell, both a methodological attitude and a moral posture. He viewed the unquestioning acceptance of dogma, whether religious, political, or scientific, as a profound danger to the development of knowledge and the well-being of societies. Russell's skepticism was shaped early by his encounter with vast systems of belief, from the religious earnestness of his family to the political certainties of his age. Through his studies in mathematics and logic, Russell realized that certainty is often illusory, a product of incomplete analysis or unexamined assumption. One of Russell's most enduring contributions was his rigorous application of skepticism to philosophical problems. In Problems of Philosophy, he dissected the limits of knowledge, distinguishing between things as they appear and things as they are. This epistemological caution did not lead him to cynicism, but rather to a measured optimism, the recognition that fallibility is the price of progress. Russell's skepticism extended beyond philosophy. He critiqued religion with formidable acumen, questioning traditional conceptions of deity, morality, and revelation. His essay, Why I Am Not a Christian, remains a watershed in freethought literature, attacking not only the logical inconsistencies of theological doctrine, but its social consequences in fostering intolerance and thwarting inquiry. In politics, Russell's skepticism served as a bulwark against fanaticism. He doubted ideological certainties and refused allegiance to systems demanding blind faith. His criticisms of communism and nationalism were grounded in a belief that reason must remain vigilant, even or especially in the face of popular enthusiasm. For Russell, skepticism was inseparable from humility. He argued that no individual, institution, or society possesses absolute truth. Progress depends upon the willingness to entertain doubt, revise opinion, and acknowledge error. This ethos stands at odds with the arrogance of closed systems, wherein questioning is forbidden or disparaged. Russell's advocacy of skepticism was also practical. He saw in critical inquiry the means to guard against deception, manipulation, and self-delusion. He urged his contemporaries to apply the scrutiny of reason to all spheres, scientific, political, and personal. The habit of questioning protects against the seduction of easy answers and dangerous certainty. Yet Russell's skepticism was not nihilistic. He was passionately committed to the pursuit of truth, even as he recognized its provisional nature. Skepticism for Russell was the handmaiden of hope, the belief that questioning, correcting and refining our beliefs leads, however slowly, toward greater understanding. In a world rife with misinformation, ideological rigidity, and intellectual conformity, Russell's valorization of skepticism endures. His life and thought challenge us to make questioning not merely an academic exercise, but a civic virtue. To question everything as Russell did is to participate in the never-ending creation of a freer, wiser society. Chapter 13. The Art of Clear Thinking, Logic as Liberation. Bertrand Russell's devotion to the art of clear thinking illuminated every aspect of his intellectual life. He believed that logic was not simply an academic discipline, but a route to personal and social liberation, a means by which confusion could be dispelled, error corrected, and authentic understanding attained. Russell's formal contributions to logic revolutionized the field. Alongside Alfred North Whitehead, his magnum opus, Principia Mathematica, established a new foundation for the logical analysis of mathematics, setting the stage for modern analytic philosophy and computer science. Russell's paradox, which exposed inconsistencies within set theory, remains a touchstone for philosophers grappling with the limits of formal systems. Yet Russell's commitment to logic transcended technical mastery. He insisted that clarity of thought was indispensable to reasoned discourse, humane politics, and ethical conduct. His philosophy of logical analysis was grounded in the conviction that errors of reasoning underlie the most persistent social and intellectual ills. Through rigorous argumentation, careful definition of terms, and systematic critique of ambiguity, Russell sought not merely to perfect philosophical method, but to emancipate minds. Russell's concept of logic as liberation extended to education. He advocated for teaching logic and critical thinking in schools, arguing that these skills equip individuals to resist propaganda, irrational fears, and manipulative rhetoric. To think clearly is to reject the muddled doctrines of superstition and prejudice, the first step toward autonomy. In politics and public debate, Russell deployed logic as a weapon against cant and obfuscation. His polemics against war, religious, dogma, and authoritarianism exemplified a style of argument that refused to concede ground to sentimentality or confusion. He believed that even the most contentious issues must submit to the discipline of rational analysis. Russell also explored the role of logic in ethical and scientific inquiry. He argued that moral reasoning demands the same clarity and consistency as mathematics. In science, the logical method distinguishes genuine discovery from wishful thinking or biased interpretation. The advance of knowledge, Russell maintained, depends upon the courage to confront contradictions and refine premises. The significance of Russell's approach endures in contemporary debates about reason and emotion, expertise and populism. His insistence that thinking clearly is a moral obligation speaks to an age endangered by misinformation and dogmatic thinking. Logic, in Russell's vision, is not arid or lifeless. It is a vibrant process of intellectual emancipation. The art of clear thinking, as Russell taught, is both an individual and collective pursuit. It requires humility, discipline, and the willingness to be corrected. Above all, it demands the courage to submit cherished beliefs to the test of reason and evidence. Through logic, Russell believed, we achieve a measure of freedom from error, from manipulation, from the tyranny of ignorance. His legacy in the art of clear thinking is not a finished achievement, but an ongoing invitation. As we strive to address confusion and complexity in our own time, Russell's advocacy of logic as liberation remains both a guide and a challenge. Chapter 14: Science, Ethics, and the Human Condition. Bertrand Russell's intellectual synthesis encompassed the profound relationships between science, ethics, and the human condition. He believed that scientific discovery and human values must be reconciled to foster progress without sacrificing humanity. This commitment shaped his contributions to both philosophical and practical debates in the 20th century. Russell's faith in science was tempered by a realism about its limits. He marveled at the power of empirical inquiry to decode the mysteries of nature, yet he cautioned against viewing science as a panacea for all human woes. He understood that science, divorced from ethical reflection, could become an instrument of destruction as much as discovery. The horrors of modern warfare, the threat of nuclear annihilation, and the misuse of technological advances deepened his conviction that science must serve human welfare, not dominate it. At the heart of Russell's ethical philosophy lay the conviction that values are not reducible to scientific facts, but neither are they wholly subjective or arbitrary. He sought a middle path, advocating for values rooted in reason, empathy, and the recognition of shared human needs. His ethical writings, especially in The Conquest of Happiness and Human Society in Ethics and Politics, emphasized the pursuit of flourishing, justice, and peace. Russell challenged the dichotomy between facts and values. He believed that rational inquiry extends to ethics, where clarity of principles and logical consistency improve moral deliberation. He rejected the notion that morality was merely a matter of tradition, authority, or divine command. Instead, he argued that ethical problems require the same scrutiny and creativity as scientific questions. In addressing the human condition, Russell was both a realist and an optimist. He acknowledged the suffering, conflict, and irrationality that pervade human history, yet he maintained faith in the capacity of individuals and societies to improve. He saw education, critical thinking, and compassionate institutions as engines of progress, echoing the best impulses of both science and ethics. Russell's analysis of science and ethics extended to political questions. He criticized the exploitation of scientific advances for war or oppression, urging that technological power be balanced by democratic oversight and moral restraint. He envisioned a society where scientific ingenuity was harnessed for public health, education, and peace, not militarism or mere profit. His reflections on happiness and meaning were grounded in the interplay between reason and emotion. Russell argued for a philosophy of life that values both skeptical inquiry and the cultivation of joy, friendship, and love. In confronting the existential uncertainties of modernity, he recommended that we seek meaning through creative engagement with the world and others. Russell's enduring belief was that the reconciliation of science and ethics is essential to human flourishing. He warned against the dangers of ignoring either domain, urging that scientific progress be accompanied by the advance of wisdom and compassion. His legacy invites us to consider the responsibilities that accompany knowledge and the values that should guide its application. In the present-day world, Russell's insights into the nexus of science, ethics, and the human condition retain their force. His example urges us to approach both inquiry and action with reason tempered by empathy, creativity allied with conscience, and the courage to pursue the good in an uncertain world. Chapter 15: The Nuclear Age, Russell's Fight for Survival and Peace. As the world entered the nuclear age, Bertrand Russell emerged as one of the most vocal and influential advocates for survival and peace. His engagement with the challenges posed by nuclear weapons and global conflict became a defining feature of his later life. Blending his philosophical rigor with urgent political activism, the detonation of atomic bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 marked, for Russell, a catastrophic juncture in human history. No longer was war merely a horror among horrors. It had become an existential threat to the survival of civilization itself. Russell's response was immediate and resolute. He denounced the use and proliferation of nuclear weapons, warning that their logic led inexorably to annihilation. Russell's activism in the nuclear age was distinguished by its clarity and courage. He co-founded the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, CND, mobilizing scientists, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens to demand an end to the arms race. He collaborated with Albert Einstein to issue the now famous Russell-Einstein Manifesto, which called on the world's leaders to renounce war and resolve disputes through rational negotiation. More than a political gesture, Russell's anti-nuclear campaign was rooted in deep philosophical concerns. He recognized that the calculus of deterrence was inherently unstable, dependent upon threats and promises that could unravel through miscalculation or madness. For Russell, the ethical imperative was clear. No ideology, national interest, or security concern justified the threat of global extinction. Russell's public interventions were often dramatic. He participated in rallies, authored urgent articles, and appeared on radio and television to educate the public about the dangers of nuclear weapons. In the face of government opposition, he willingly risked arrest and imprisonment, convinced that civil disobedience was a necessary response to existential peril. Even as Russell denounced nuclear armament, he remained committed to reasoned dialogue. He engaged with policymakers, scientists, and adversaries alike, believing that the solution to global conflict ultimately lay in cooperative deliberation and trust. He urged the creation of international institutions robust enough to safeguard peace and prevent accidental or intentional catastrophe. Russell's analysis of the nuclear age extended beyond the technical and political. He understood that the specter of annihilation affected the human psyche, breeding anxiety, fatalism, and apathy. He sought to dispel the paralysis of fear by advocating for hope, action, and the restoration of moral seriousness in public life. Throughout his campaign, Russell argued that the struggle for survival and peace was inseparable from the struggle for reason and justice. He insisted that the abolition of nuclear weapons was a precondition for genuine social progress, and that activism must be informed by the insights of both science and ethics. Russell's legacy in the nuclear age was profound. His advocacy contributed to the emergence of global movements for disarmament and the strengthening of international law. His example encouraged later generations to confront the dangers of technological power with the courage of conscience. In today's world, where the threat of nuclear conflict persists amidst new forms of instability, Russell's warnings and hopes remain indispensable. His fight for survival and peace calls upon us to unite reason, activism, and moral responsibility in a shared struggle for the future of humanity. Chapter 16, Friendship and Debate, Russell, Wittgenstein, and the Circle of Minds. In the perplexing corridors of Trinity College, Cambridge, the intellectual ferment of early 20th century philosophy reached its zenith. Bertrand Russell, already a rising luminary in the field, became the nucleus of a vibrant circle of minds, constantly seeking, probing, and questioning the contours of reason itself. This chapter unravels the complex tapestry of relationships and intellectual exchanges that defined Russell's formative years, particularly his association with Ludwig Wittgenstein and the constellation of thinkers who revolutionized analytical philosophy. Russell's arrival at Cambridge in the 1890s coincided with the emergence of an academic culture deeply invested in the rigorous pursuit of truth. Under the mentorship of Alfred North Whitehead, Russell honed his logical acumen, soon distinguishing himself through penetrating analyses of mathematical foundations and the principles of logic. It was during this time that Russell encountered the young and enigmatic Wittgenstein, a meeting that would irrevocably alter the philosophical landscape. Wittgenstein entered Russell's orbit as a restless student, wrestling with questions that verged on the mystical. Yet despite their contrasting temperaments, Russell's systematic clarity and Wittgenstein's intensity, their dialogue revealed a shared passion for philosophical purity. Together, they confronted the ambiguities of language and meaning, striving for an unassailable foundation for human knowledge. Russell was both mentor and challenger, guiding Wittgenstein through the labyrinthine puzzles of logic, all the while becoming increasingly fascinated by Wittgenstein's original, sometimes radical, approach. The Russell-Wittgenstein relationship was characterized by a productive tension. Their conversations, often conducted in Russell's office or during walks within Trinity's ancient courtyards, became legendary for their intellectual fervor and emotional depth. Russell admired Wittgenstein's brilliance, describing him as possessing the most perfect philosophical mind he had ever encountered. While being bewildered by Wittgenstein's uncompromising, at times mercurial, quest for truth, beyond Wittgenstein, Russell participated in the lively exchanges of the Cambridge Apostles, a semi-secret society composed of the university's brightest minds. Here, debates on moral philosophy, metaphysics, and political theory flourished, shaped by Russell's commitment to unfettered inquiry and the democratic ideal of reasoning. The Apostles fostered a spirit of intellectual egalitarianism, encouraging members to question everything and defend their beliefs through rational discourse. The intersections between Russell and his circle bore enduring fruit. The foundational work Principia Mathematica, co-authored with Whitehead, stemmed in part from insights and challenges posed by peers. The effort to articulate the logical underpinnings of mathematics represented not just a personal endeavor, but a collective intellectual movement. Russell's engagement with contemporary thinkers such as G.E. Moore and John Maynard Keynes further expanded the scope of his interests, encompassing social and political philosophy alongside pure logic, yet these relationships were not devoid of conflict. Russell's unwillingness to compromise on matters of principle sometimes led to estrangement. His break with Wittgenstein was poignant, the result of deep philosophical divergences regarding the nature of logic and the function of language. Nonetheless, even in disagreement, Russell maintained a profound respect for Wittgenstein's originality. At the heart of these friendships and debates was Russell's unwavering belief in the value of dialogue. He viewed philosophy not as a solitary pursuit, but as a collaborative, often contentious process whereby minds meet, grapple, and refine ideas through reasoned exchange. The circle of minds at Cambridge exemplified this ethos, their debates sharpening not only their own intellectual frameworks, but setting the agenda for generations to come. Russell recognized, too, the emotional dimension of philosophical engagement. His connection with Wittgenstein, marked by affection, frustration, and admiration, attests to the deep bonds that rigorous thought can forge. He confessed to moments of doubt, insecurity, and empathy, acknowledging the human cost of relentless inquiry. These relationships underscore the personal, as well as the intellectual courage required to think freely, to risk disagreement, alienation, and misunderstanding in the pursuit of higher truths. The legacy of Russell's circle at Cambridge lies in its demonstration of philosophy as a living conversation. The philosophical problems they confronted, of meaning, knowledge, morality, remain unresolved, yet ever fertile ground for new generations. Through friendship and debate, they modeled the courage to challenge orthodoxy, the humility to revise one's beliefs, and the resilience to persist despite ambiguity. In exploring the dynamic interplay between Russell, Wittgenstein, and the circle of minds, this chapter sets the stage for a deeper examination of Russell's life and ideas. It affirms that intellectual greatness is seldom a solitary achievement. Rather, it emerges from the contentious, passionate, and transformative encounter of minds dedicated to the bold pursuit of truth. Chapter 17, The Limits of Knowledge, What We Can and Cannot Know. Bertrand Russell's philosophical journey was deeply marked by his relentless quest to map the frontiers of human knowledge. Having mastered the formidable complexities of logic and mathematics, Russell soon confronted the profound limitations inherent in all forms of inquiry. This chapter probes his lifelong investigation into what we can and cannot know, illuminating how Russell's thought evolved from the optimism of logicism to the sober acceptance of epistemological boundaries. At the outset, Russell's vision was ambitious. Immersed in the intellectual ferment of the late 19th century, he aspired to establish certainty in mathematics and logic, a foundation that could secure knowledge against the tides of skepticism. The publication of Principia Mathematica, co-authored with Alfred North Whitehead, was the manifestation of this ideal. Russell believed that through the rigorous application of symbolic logic, the entirety of mathematics could be derived from a set of self-evident axioms. Yet, as Russell and his contemporaries pressed deeper, cracks began to appear even in the most meticulously constructed systems. The emergence of paradoxes, like Russell's own paradox of set theory, undermined the hope for absolute certainty. These conundrums revealed the fragility of logical foundations and forced Russell to revise his philosophical stance. His embrace of logical atomism reflected this shift, as he attempted to decompose reality into discrete facts connected by logical relationships. Rather than seeking monolithic certainties, Russell's engagement with epistemology, the study of knowledge, became more nuanced. He grappled with the distinction between knowledge by acquaintance, which is immediate and direct, and knowledge by description, which is mediated and inferential. This framework clarified how much of our understanding relies on indirect knowledge, subject to inference and interpretation. Russell acknowledged that, while some truths may be grasped directly, most of our beliefs are constructed from descriptions that are vulnerable to error. The challenge of skepticism haunted Russell throughout his career. He recognized that many philosophical questions concerning the external world, the existence of other minds, and the nature of consciousness admit of no definitive answers. Rather than yielding to despair, Russell advocated for a measured response, humility in the face of uncertainty and vigilance in the appraisal of evidence. His work anticipated the traditions of analytic philosophy, promoting clarity, precision, and a critical stance toward dogmatic assertions. Russell believed that recognizing the limits of knowledge is itself a mark of intellectual maturity. He warned against the dangers of certitude, whether religious, ideological, or scientific, asserting that the refusal to admit ignorance is the seed of folly and tyranny. For Russell, genuine wisdom resides in the acknowledgement that some questions remain open, that doubt is an integral aspect of rational inquiry, and that intellectual progress depends on flexibility and open-mindedness. The practical implications of Russell's epistemology were profound. In his public life, Russell was an advocate for education that cultivates critical thinking rather than rote acceptance. He feared the consequences of societies that suppress dissent and valorize certainty, seeing in such tendencies the prelude to authoritarianism and intellectual stagnation. Russell's insistence on intellectual freedom was rooted not just in abstract principle, but in the lived reality of fallible human beings, striving to make sense of an ambiguous world. Russell's journey through the limits of knowledge was not linear. It was marked by doubt, revision, and ongoing debate. He was keenly aware of the provisional nature of all philosophical constructions and urged his readers to cultivate habits of skepticism, inquiry, and self-reflection. The acknowledgement of ignorance, for Russell, is not an admission of defeat, but a call to humility and persistent effort. In the context of modern thought, Russell's examination of knowledge and its limits remains acutely relevant. The proliferation of information and the rise of ideological polarization in contemporary society highlight the necessity of Russell's virtues: openness to critique, willingness to revise one's views, and courage to admit uncertainty. His philosophical legacy is not a set of final answers, but an enduring method, a way of approaching questions that balances rigor with modesty. This chapter illuminates how Russell's exploration of the limits of knowledge shaped his intellectual development and public engagement. It affirms that the boundaries of understanding, far from confining thought, serve to liberate it, inviting all who seek truth to embrace inquiry, resist dogma, and persevere in the quest for reason. Chapter 18. Living with Courage, Defying the Conformity of the Crowd. Russell's intellectual courage was not confined to the realm of abstract speculation. It was manifest in the choices he made throughout his life, often at considerable personal risk. This chapter examines how Russell defied the pressure of conformity, proclaiming the necessity of living with integrity and independent judgment, even in societies bent on suppressing dissent and subduing individuality. To understand Russell's rejection of conformity, one must first appreciate the historical context in which he lived. The early 20th century was characterized by sweeping social, political, and economic changes, 2 world wars, the rise of fascism and communism, and the enduring shadow of Victorian moral codes. Within this maelstrom, Russell emerged as a vocal critic of war, nationalism, and oppressive social institutions. His public opposition to the First World War led to imprisonment, loss of academic positions, and widespread denunciation. Russell's defiance was rooted in principle. He refused to sanction violence and war merely because it was the prevailing consensus. His stance was not popular. He was branded as unpatriotic, irresponsible, and even dangerous. Yet Russell maintained that the true danger lay in the uncritical acceptance of authority, the surrender of individual conscience to the dictates of the collective. He viewed moral and intellectual autonomy as the bedrock of a just society and believed that ethical progress depends on individuals willing to challenge convention. The theme of nonconformity recurs throughout Russell's writings. In On the Value of Skepticism, he warns against the herd instinct and the relentless drive to seek safety in numbers. Russell saw in conformity the erosion of creativity, the curtailment of critical analysis, and the genesis of oppression. He championed the right to dissent, arguing that progress in thought and in society is achieved only when individuals dare to question prevailing norms. Living with courage, for Russell, entails not merely holding unpopular opinions, but speaking them plainly and defending them with reason. He abhorred the hypocrisy of societies that exalt freedom in principle, but punish those who exercise it in practice. He advocated for tolerance, not as mere indulgence, but as a moral imperative. Russell's life serves as a model for the hazards and responsibilities of intellectual freedom. As he faced professional ostracism, legal penalties, and public condemnation for his convictions, Russell understood the psychological cost of nonconformity. He wrote candidly about loneliness, alienation, and the martyrdom of those who stand against the crowd. Yet he maintained that such suffering is the price of authenticity. The courage to think freely is inseparable from the willingness to endure misunderstanding, rejection, and conflict. Russell drew strength from his commitment to truth and from the examples of others who had suffered for their beliefs. Despite the challenges, Russell's refusal to conform had a lasting impact. His moral philosophy, premised on the autonomy of reason and the necessity of dissent, influenced generations of thinkers, activists, and reformers. He became a symbol of principled resistance, advocating civil liberties and human rights at a time when such ideas were far from mainstream. His participation in anti-nuclear protests, educational reform, and campaigns for peace highlighted the inseparability of philosophical conviction and social engagement. Russell's legacy also challenges us to reconsider the meaning of courage in intellectual life. Courage is not expressed in bluster or bravado, but in the willingness to endure uncertainty and risk for the sake of principle. Russell's model demands that thinkers resist not only external pressures, but the internal temptations of comfort and complacency. In today's world, the question of conformity remains urgent. The proliferation of consensus thinking, digital echo chambers, and ideological polarization poses new threats to the autonomy of reason. Russell's example invites us to retain skepticism toward popular opinion, to defend the rights of dissenters, and to maintain dialogue across lines of difference. This chapter affirms that living with courage means embracing the inherent tensions of freedom, the conflict between individual conscience and collective expectation, the struggle between honesty and acceptance. Russell's life, marked by principled defiance and intellectual rigor, stands as a beacon for all who aspire to live boldly, think freely, and resist the seductions of conformity. Chapter 19, Legacy of a Rebel Mind, the enduring relevance of Russell's ideas. The legacy of Bertrand Russell extends far beyond his historical context, permeating the philosophical and cultural foundations of our contemporary world. This chapter traces the enduring relevance of Russell's ideas, examining how his rebel mind continues to inform debates on logic, ethics, politics, and the broader struggle for intellectual autonomy. Russell's intellectual contributions were numerous and transformative. In logic and mathematics, his work on set theory and symbolic logic reshaped both the philosophical and practical understanding of formal systems. The Russell paradox exposed foundational vulnerabilities that reverberate through mathematical logic even today. Through Principia Mathematica, Russell and Whitehead set a standard for rigor that underpins much of modern analytic philosophy, influencing generations of scholars in disciplines ranging from linguistics to computer science. But Russell's impact was far from technical. His philosophical method, characterized by clarity, skepticism, and an unwavering defense of reason, provided a template for critical inquiry. He insisted on the importance of precise definitions, the avoidance of vague generalizations, and the relentless pursuit of intellectual transparency. Russell's logical atomism advanced the analytic tradition, emphasizing the decomposition of complex ideas into their simpler constituents as a means to achieve clarity. Russell's ethical and political writings resonate in the ongoing struggle for human rights, civil liberties, and social justice. In Why I Am Not a Christian, he publicly challenged religious orthodoxies and advocated for a secular moral framework grounded in compassion, reason, and autonomy. His fearless critique of dogma, whether religious or political, symbolized the necessity of questioning authority and defending the freedom of thought. One of Russell's most significant legacies is his activism for peace and justice. He spoke out against militarism and nuclear proliferation, often risking imprisonment and public scorn. Russell demonstrated that philosophers must not remain cloistered in academic abstraction, but must engage with urgent moral crises. His advocacy for civil disobedience, non-violent protest, and the rights of the marginalized has inspired countless activists, reinforcing the inseparability of thought and action. Russell's rebel mind also shaped approaches to education. He believed that schools and universities should cultivate critical thinking, not merely transmit established truths. Russell's vision of education required the fostering of questioning, creativity, and independence. seeking to liberate students from the constraints of rote learning and ideological indoctrination. In contemporary contexts, Russell's ideas attain renewed vitality. The complexities of global society, ranging from the spread of misinformation to the erosion of civil liberties, demand the kind of intellectual vigilance that Russell championed. His insistence on skepticism, rational inquiry, and tolerance offers essential tools for navigating the uncertainties of the modern age. The enduring relevance of Russell's legacy is evident in the continued examination of fundamental questions. What does it mean to know? How should we live? What is the relationship between reason and emotion, autonomy and community? Russell refused to offer easy answers, instead providing methods and attitudes capable of withstanding the shifting tides of history. Perhaps Russell's greatest gift is his model of intellectual independence. He exemplified the courage to stand apart from the crowd, to challenge official narratives, and to persist in the search for truth despite adversity. The rebel mind, for Russell, is not defined by opposition for its own sake, but by the principled refusal to conform to falsehood, dogma, or injustice. This chapter concludes that Russell's legacy is not a static inheritance, but a living practice. His ideas and examples summon each generation to the labor of thinking freely, acting courageously, and questioning relentlessly. In a world where conformity is often incentivized and dissent punished, Russell's rebel mind remains an essential guide, a source of inspiration, challenge, and hope. Chapter 20, Think Freely, Live Boldly, the modern application of Russell's wisdom, the wisdom of Bertrand Russell, though conceived in an earlier century, possesses an uncanny relevance to the dilemmas and aspirations of contemporary life. To think freely and live boldly constitutes not only a philosophical ideal, but a practical toolkit for navigating the complexities of today's world. Russell's insights offer a lens through which we might confront the challenges of conformity, technological upheaval, and the perennial quest for meaning. In an epoch defined by rapid change, the pressure to conform is omnipresent. Media influences, workplace norms, and even scientific institutions regulate thought and behavior. Russell's insistence on intellectual autonomy addresses these forces directly. He counsels the cultivation of skepticism, an active, attentive engagement with information and authority. For Russell, skepticism was not synonymous with cynicism, but with the capacity to distinguish between what is accepted and what is true. In today's context, where misinformation abounds, his advice to doubt until you have reason not to is a bulwark against credulity and manipulation. In professional and personal contexts, Russell's wisdom implores us to act with integrity. The decision to diverge from groupthink, whether by advancing innovative ideas or resisting unethical practices, mirrors Russell's own confrontations with the establishment. His encouragement to live boldly is evident in his persistent activism, his willingness to challenge prevailing ideas, and his unwavering belief in the moral agency of the individual. Modern leaders, educators, and citizens derive inspiration from Russell's capacity to balance conviction with humility. Russell's promotion of rational discourse remains instructive amid contemporary polarization. Social media and global communication have accelerated the spread of opinion, but do not guarantee understanding. Russell's advocacy for logical analysis and calm debate provides a template for restoring civil discussion. He emphasized that disagreements need not devolve into animosity. Reason serves as the common language through which competing views may be reconciled or respectfully maintained. Education represents another sphere where Russell's contribution is invaluable. He championed curricula that fostered critical thinking, curiosity, and intellectual independence. Today's educators grapple with standardized testing and ideological pressures, yet Russell's vision of education as the cultivation of free minds persists. By encouraging students to question, innovate, and empathize, we carry forward the torch he lit. Ethically, Russell's philosophy articulates a balance between autonomy and responsibility. He advocated for personal freedom, but insisted on compassion and respect for others. In an age of increased individualism, his reflections remind us that liberty must be paired with social consciousness. Russell's campaigns for peace, justice, and equality serve as practical models for modern activism, demonstrating that free thought is inseparable from ethical action. The application of Russell's wisdom in the 21st century requires courage, discernment, and a willingness to embrace complexity. It is no panacea. Rather, it is a set of principles, skepticism, empathy, reason, dissent, by which we might construct lives defined by purpose and integrity. Thinking freely and living boldly, as Russell taught, emboldens us to bridge the gap between contemplation and action. It is both an invitation and a challenge to shape the world according to enlightened values, to resist the tranquilizing comfort of consensus, and to realize the inherent dignity of the solitary, courageous mind. If you found this video helpful, inspiring, or entertaining, don't forget to hit that like button. And if you're new here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on future content. Your support means the world. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.